Okay. Thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our tax research seminars, which will happen approximately every 2 weeks. We'll keep you posted by the tax mailing list, which I assume you're all on. That's why you're here. If you're not, then you can let me or Ignacio know, and we'll send you a link to get on the mailing list. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Nuno Palma, who is a professor of economics here at Manchester. He's also the director of the Arthur Lewis Lab for Comparative Development and a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. He got his PhD from the LSE in London in 2016. He's an economic historian and a macroeconomist, and he focuses on monetary history and long-run growth. Some of his recent publications, to give you a kind of sense of what he does, are As Causas do Atraso Português, which was in 2023, the causes of Portuguese backwardness, I guess I'd say. And a couple of his recent articles or forthcoming articles are American Treasure and the Decline of Spain, and The Cross of Gold, Brazilian Treasure and the Decline of Portugal. So today he's going to talk about African slavery and the reckoning of Brazil. So Nuno, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us. And
thanks so much, Peter, and it's great to be here and speak to a slightly different audience than the ones I usually speak. But that's great, we can build bridges, and interdisciplinary talks are always. Sometimes universities speak about the importance of interdisciplinarities. They don't always support interdisciplinary work as much as they should. It's good we can talk about the same things. So without further ado, this is John Werk Guilherme Baixo, based in Luzia, the University of Lisbon. So let me start with a question. Do you have a good sense of how many slaves were brought from Africa to the modern territory of the United States, the territory of what today is the United States of America, over the 350, so a little less odd years of the Atlantic slave trade? How many? Do you have a number? Ballpark number. How many slaves, African slaves, during the Atlantic slave trade were brought from Africa to the territory that is now the United States of America?
250,000. 4 million.
You're close.
surprisingly few is what I would say.
Yeah, so you said 250,000, somebody said 4 million. But you're the one that is kind of right. So the correct number is, as you can see here, 300,000 during 2.5 centuries. If you compare with Brazil, you see the magnitude of the difference. To Brazil, there were 3.2 million. So it is by far the country that received the most African slaves by a huge margin, right? And that's bigger than anywhere else that became a country, because Caribbean received 4.4 million, but different colonial powers were in the Caribbean. There were the Dutch, there were the Spanish, there were the English in Jamaica, right? There were the Dutch in Cuba. The Spanish in Cuba. So there is different colonial powers in the Caribbean. So as a single country, Brazil is the one that by far received the most. So these numbers, these comparative numbers alone, I suggest to you, immediately should pause these comparisons to any ideas that slavery somehow made Western countries rich. Because if slavery made Western countries rich, Portugal and Brazil should be the richest countries in the world, right? And that was not the case. Portugal and Brazil, in fact, failed to have industrialized, failed to have industrial revolution, and in the 19th century, they were among the poorest countries that existed in their respective world regions. So clearly, this, again, should put some pause on a very simple-minded idea that goes from slavery to Western development. That is not to say that individual merchants couldn't get rich through slavery. There was, in all of these regions, individual merchants that did get rich through slavery. But that is very different from claiming that the West as a whole got rich because of slavery. right? That slavery was some sort of engine of economic development or capital accumulation, of wealth accumulation for the West. If that was true, again, Brazil and Portugal should have become the richest countries. So the question we ask in this paper is, what are the consequences of the slave trade for Brazil's development? And we're going to offer an novel interpretation of the slave trade created a slavery economy that underdeveloped Brazil. It made Brazil poorer than it would have been without the slave trade. To do this, we collect new archival data to build a real wage and slave price series for more than 3 centuries, between 1574 and 1920, for 2 important regions of Brazil, both of which were closely associated with the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, Bahia and Rio de Janeiro. So we use new hand-collected data from archives in Brazil and Portugal, over 15,000 observations. Then we focus on international comparability. We're going to build real wages, so wages corrected to inflation, to the cost of buying a basket of goods over time, so that they could be compared with other countries at any given time. And we're going to have an economic model that explains the context and what is the explanation that we have about why this locked in Brazil into a not so great development path. All of this so far is kind of descriptive evidence. It's like this happened and that happened. And we are then moving to a causal approach where we can move from correlations to causation, where we use slave prohibition shocks to estimate the causal effect of ending the slave trade. And we're going to show, to tell you a bit, some more of that on the next slide, that's actually going to raise wages of free men. So we contribute to the study of real wages in a global perspective. The case of Brazil here, which was completely absent in the literature, is critical. So we find that real wages in Brazil were initially quite high compared with Europe in the 16th century, but coincidentally with a huge increase of the number of slaves arriving to Brazil from Africa, the wages that free men get to work, unskilled free men that are in competition for the same kinds of jobs with slaves, is going to fall a lot over time. So Brazil is going to get poorer over time. And the abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century is going to then increase wages finally and accelerate technical change in Brazil, leading to a new low slavery equilibrium. We use a statistical method called synthetic differences in differences to show that when the slavery is abolished, Atlantic slavery, there's 3 different moments, only the third is really enforced. But each of those moments that the British are trying to enforce abolitions in Atlantic slave trade leads to rises in the wages for free men. Historical evidence on technological change towards free labor after prohibition then shows we have a census for 1872, which is still about 16 years before slavery was completely abolished in Brazil. That's 1888. And we still observe slaves in the 1872 census, and we see they're concentrated in certain high effort activities. I'll show you evidence on that in a second. So that's completely consistent with our model. And so in sum, our results suggest that the slave trade didn't benefit Brazil. The slave trade created backwardness for Brazil. So ending the slave trade was not just something that was good for humanitarian reasons, but also it was good for Brazil's economic development in the long run. And again, the comparative suggestion from that is that it's not the slave trade really that made Britain or the United States rich. That's frankly absurd. And so here is real wages and slave trade in the Americas as a whole. This is Brazil in red. These are the Americas. All the other locations for which we have data, comparative data done by other economic historians for the Americas. And what you can see is that places in the America that received more slaves, this is the axis. If you go up here, this is more slaves were disembarked in those areas. They tended to have lower wages. And places in the Americas that had less slaves disembarked, such as Massachusetts, would have had higher wages. And this is natural because, because free men were competing for slaves for the same type of jobs. For example, in the cities, domestic labor, in the countryside, in farms, agricultural labor. And so if you're competing with a slave, you can hardly demand a very high wage as a free man. That's also why large-scale immigration to Brazil only really started in the second half of the 19th century, not before. Immigration of free men. Here's some evidence on the kind of lock-in that you get in this kind of society. If you have a lot of slaves, they have to be carrying around things by hands because it's cheap. You have a lot of slaves, you don't need to invest in machinery to do the job. Once slavery is abolished, the final year of the Atlantic slave trade, 1850s, really enforced no more Atlantic slave trade after 1850. Quickly, you have to move to build some technologies because you can no longer rely on a large body of slaves to do the job, because in Brazil, this always requires fresh supplies of slaves arriving because they are dying and they needed to be replaced. So this is Salvador da Bahia in 1671. This is how it's looking. Salvador da Bahia, the capital of Bahia. Bahia's capital, Salvador, was the first capital of Brazil from 1549 to 1763. It was the main port in the Americas and the most populous city in Brazil until the turn of the 18th century, home to some of the most important earliest sugar mills in Brazil, produced mainly sugar and tobacco for export, large production of cassava flour and cattle for domestic consumption, and one of the largest slave imports in the Americas. There was a main connection with West Africa, the Guinea Gulf region. The other city that we study here in this study is Rio de Janeiro, Brazil's capital from 1763 to 1960, one of Brazil's largest cities, major coffee production center, became the largest slave import in the world, main connection with West Central Africa and Angola region, a major industrial center and a major capital market center. So we use primary sources, archival sources, such as some of them are physically located in Lisbon, some such as in Torre do Tombo, Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, some are in Brazil, in Santa Casa da Misericórdia, Salvador da Bahia, these holy houses, charities that existed over centuries, and they typically keep account books, some for convents, hospitals, public inventories from Public Archive, National Archive of the city of Rio de Janeiro. And so they have account books. And so the account books are, in the case of the monasteries and so on, that once they're expropriated, this goes to public archives. Some are still in their original locations, such as the Santa Casa da Misericórdia. Some are in the archives. This is the earliest one we have. It's from a sugar mill that was originally owned by this guy. And it goes back to the mid-16th century. This is another archive. We use Santa Casa da Misericórdia da Bahia. And this is how the data looks like. You can think of this as an Excel for the 16th century, in this case, early 17th century. What it does is it lists prices and wages of things. How much does it cost to buy something? Because these institutions, such as Santa Casa da Misericórdia, they need to buy things. They need to buy bread, they need to hire labor. If they're constructing something, if they're fixing a roof, they are hiring labor. And every day they're buying bread, they're buying linen for clothes, they're buying candles, they're buying foods of all kinds, chicken, so on. And so we have the prices of things, and we have the wages also that people are earning. So you can think of, across the world, economic historians have rebuilt living standards over different centuries, over different societies. And the way to understand what we've done is actually very simple. If you think that, in a given society, you earn a wage in a monetary unit. For example, 2025, right now, you earn your wage in pounds, right? You get paid in pounds. But of course, you cannot compound pound sterling from 2025 with pound sterling from the year 2000, 25 years ago, Because if you go to the supermarket, the price of chicken also has changed. So at the minimum, you have to compare, to make comparisons that are meaningful across space, across different countries, and across time. You need to correct how much you earn in monetary units by how much things cost, right? That's obvious. So you need some sort of price basket to deflate your nominal monetary wage in monetary units. So here's a very simple example of a way to deflate. I don't know if I can write somewhere, I just say it verbally. So suppose your wage is 200 pounds per week. I mean, not even a PhD student gets that. But so suppose it's 2,000 pounds per week, right? I mean, you can divide that by how much a basket costs. Suppose you love chicken, all you eat is chicken, right? So if a chicken costs 10 pounds, and if you earn 200 per week, you can eat 20 chickens per week. You know, that's what you can buy. So you can see how many chickens per week you can buy with your wage over the centuries, for example, right? So that's that is deflating your wage by chickens. Of course, people rely on more than chickens to eat, but this is the basic idea. We can build a basket with different goods and compare. And we're going to get to that in a second. So just so you look how the data looks like, this is 17th century one, this is mid 17th century. Some of them will look, you know, this is kind of the pity slide, so you can see what we have to go through. And, you know, later on, they become more legible often, as you can see here. This one is late 18th century. This is early 19th century. This is early 20th century already, 1920. This is when we end this study. Okay, so we're going to then build that basket. Now, for the basket to make sense, it has to be comparable across countries, but it also has to take into account the local consumption patterns of countries, right? If in Brazil they were not eating smoked salmon, we shouldn't be making them import salmon, right? So we have to take into account what they're eating. So this study is originally started to be done for Europe and the US, making some comparisons. So they take into account the local consumption patterns that we know from probate inventories and so on of what people typically consumed in Europe, which was, you know, a lot of wheat, for example, in Europe. And so, you know, in different countries, consumption patterns are due to cultural and local environmental agricultural conditions are different. For example, in Argentina, they eat a lot of meat. China and Japan, they eat different things. So this has been done by different economic historians for different parts of the world. And what we've done in this paper is build the basket for Brazil. Of course, the important thing about the basket as far as the food is concerned is that we respect the total number of calories and protein content, right? Otherwise, the baskets wouldn't be comparable across countries. But we don't have to have the exact same foods being consumed. In fact, if you were looking for, you know, rice or butter in Brazil, it wouldn't even be in the sources. They just wouldn't be eating that in Brazil. So we have to respect what they were eating, which was cassava flour, beans, and meat. And then, you know, for other goods that are not foods, such as soap, linen, cotton, lamp, candles, lamp oil for lighting, and fuel for heating, and so on, those we keep constant across countries. Some countries, people, for different reasons, have used smaller quantity of fuel, like in West Africa, because most of the year is you don't need as much heating. But you know, this has a very low weight on the basket anyway. You can see we respect around 2,000 calories per day and 60 protein per day, more or less. Now, this is just a benchmark. It's how much one such basket costs, right? That we're not saying that necessarily eating 2,000 calories, 60 protein per day. We're saying how much does it cost to consume 2,000 calories and 60 protein per day, so we can build baskets that are international comparable. So think of that as the denominator, how we're going to deflate the wage, and how we're going to collect wages for laborers, daily unskilled laborers, the ones that were there in competition with the slaves, such as helpers of carpenters or masons. In the case of construction, we collect them for males and females and for free and enslaved. How do we collect the wages for enslaved if they're slaves after all? Well, we can, because enslaved, first, sometimes they could be rented out. So if they are rented out, we can observe how much the master is charging to rent them by the day. And secondly, slaves in Catholic countries typically had one free day a week, Sunday typically, and they could rent themselves out for that day to try to save money to buy their freedom one day. And so both the first case, so-called escravos de ganho in Brazil, rented out slaves, and the second case, through both cases, we often do observe the wage of a slave. And so daily wages are monetary payments free of in-kind transfers. So they don't get like free bread or anything. So we assume 250 working days. This is a normalization for international comparisons because we observe wages by day. Then we take, when we observe more than a price or a wage for a given year, for a given location, we just take the median. Well, we can use the mean that the result is similar. And then we're going to deflate, and this is what we get, right? So we get that in the early, around 1600 or so, late 16th century, a free worker in Brazil could consume, 6 to 9 of those baskets, right? So they could consume, 10,000 calories per day if they want them, if they're spending everything on food, right? They are quite rich. This is rich, you can consume 6. You think of one basket as subsistence. One basket is 2,000 calories per day. Think of that as basic subsistence, so you can just survive, right? Basic subsistence means one basket. You could buy 6 to 9 baskets, right, per day. That's good, That's a good living standard. Some countries, some of the poorest countries in the world today people cannot buy 6 to 9 baskets. And so, and they are so early on Brazil was not good. This is the key takeaway. And then during the 17th century, coincident with huge number of slaves entering the country, actually the wage of free workers falls a lot. And when you get to the early 19th century, you are down to about 3 baskets. So at that point, Brazil, and down to even 2 baskets or close to 1 basket. This red line is subsistence. This red, black is men, gray is women. So women at some point even fall below subsistence, so they're kind of starving, right? And so you can see that, clearly the story of Brazil is not a story of a country that is growing richer over time. It's a country that is growing poorer over time. And then when Brazil, around the first half of the 19th century, gradually abolished slavery, finally the wage starts rising again. So we have these other comparisons for other parts of the world that economic historians have done. And you can then compare Brazil with what's happening in other countries. So for example, compare with Europe, upper left, you can see on the upper left that Brazil initially, around mid-16th century, had a living standards for free wage earners, unskilled wage earners, that were, kind of average European levels. And it remained so until mid-17th century, but then it crashes down. And by the 18th century, Brazil is poorer than anywhere else in Europe, anywhere in Europe. And it remains so into 1900 and into the present, really. In part B here, you can see compared with North America, as late as mid-17th century, Brazil is actually average. It's richer than many locations in North America as late as 1750. That's no longer true by 1700. As late as 1650, sorry, that's no longer true by 1700, and then Brazil remains much poorer than North America. Compared with Latin America, Brazil starts richer than most other Latin American locations. By 1700, it's poorer than most Latin American locations, and by 1800, it's poorer than anywhere else in Latin America, including all the Spanish Empire, which was about to break down, but hadn't yet in 1800. And so compared with Africa and Asia, we don't have as much data for those, so we're bundling Africa and Asia together. You can see that Brazil starts much richer, and then as time goes by, Brazil, by 1800 is kind of average compared to Africa and Asia. So it kind of converges down to the levels of Africa and Asia. And then by 1900, Brazil is again richer than most African and Asian locations. because of the rise that Brazil experienced after abolishing the slave trade. So you can see the coincidence of those two things as a correlation here. You can see that initially, red is Salvadoran Rio, the average of both. Slaves disembarked, there's a huge amount of slaves disembarked between 1650 and 1850, huge amount, and much larger than in other locations, including the Spanish Americas or Jamaica. And so including Jamaica, and as you can see that Brazil, huge numbers compared with the others of slaves, and coinciding with these huge numbers of slaves getting in, the wage for free men is falling. That's just a correlation. One thing is going up, the other thing is going down. It doesn't prove causality by itself. It doesn't prove that the slaves are causing the free wage to fall, but it suggested that they might. And we're going to give you some more direct evidence that they, in fact, were causing this in a second. So now we have economic model, like essentially what the model does is a lot of math to essentially have one key insight, which is this, which is that Brazil was locked in an equilibrium that was a low wage equilibrium, a low technical change equilibrium for the free man because it was a slave-based equilibrium. That's the key insight of the economic model. It's a lot of math to say that. So let me skip to the price of enslaved workers and wages of free workers. We also have the price of slaves. The price of a prime enslaved male is shown here in black. You can see that the prices of slaves are pretty, we observe this directly. These are not inputted, not extrapolated, not guessed, not we observe them. And we can see that over time, they're kind of flat. There's not a lot of evolution. And if you compare that with the annual wage of unskilled free men, there's the difference over time is kind of fixed. So you can think of if you have a company, a firm, or you have a farm, and you want to decide, I want to make money, you're a businessman. You have to decide, do I require on free wage labor or do I require on slave labor? If you require on free wage labor, this is what you have to pay every year. If you require a slave, you have to buy the slave, so you have a bigger capital investment, or you have to rent the slave. That's another option. If you rent the slave, this is what you're paying, the wage of enslaved male, and you can see that the rent is very similar to the cost of renting a slave. It's very similar to the cost of hiring a free man to do the same job. That's natural. Those two markets are integrated. If one was cheaper than the other, people would always use the cheapest of the two. So they have to be kind of together all the time. It's like having a supermarket next to another that has lower prices. That's not possible, right? Nobody would go to the most expensive if it's essentially the same substitutable products. If you are buying a slave to recover your investment after a few years, you can see that typically the price of a slave is maybe about 7 to 8, 9 times the wage. That means if you invest in the capital to buy a slave, over less than 10 years, you will have recovered the cost. And that's kind of constant over time, but then something breaks down in the 19th century. As the Atlantic slave trade breaks down, a lot less slaves come into the country, the prices of slaves completely shoots up. Suddenly, it's very expensive to buy a slave because there's no fresh supplies from Africa anymore. And although the wages also rise, the price of slaves rises a lot more. So it essentially becomes, prohibition is going to abruptly raise the slave prices and consequently the wages for free workers. And this is the timing. To get to a more causal, to convince you that the results are causal, not just correlations, we're going to rely on these different timings. In 1808, the British are going to prohibit Atlantic slave trade everywhere, but in Brazil, this was very weakly enforced, and I'll show you evidence that that was the case. This is repeated in 1831. In Brazil, it's temporarily enforced, but it's really per English ver for the Englishmen to see. And it's more on paper, not on reality. And I'll show you some data on that. Elsewhere it is enforced. And 1950 it's really completely enforced everywhere. You can see that this was the case in this graph. So this is Salvador Rio again in red. And you can see that with the first prohibition here, it's only for 1 year that the number of slaves arriving to disembarked in Brazil falls. It's really 1 year, and it goes back to normal. If something increases more relative to before, because it was being forced elsewhere, so the supplies didn't, the only source of demand was Brazil. And so there was no effect much, only for a year or two here, and then it's back to 1808. In 1831, it really falls a lot again. You see, it falls almost to zero for a couple of years. But then with time, it creeps up again, the slave trade. Maybe they got scared here again, it falls again, but then when time is creeping up again, then 1850 is complete prohibition. You can see that by contrast with Brazil, all these other locations, really it stopped in 1807, including Jamaica, Middle Countries, New England, Rio de la Plata, Spanish Americas, up in southern colonies. This is southern US. Okay, so then what we're going to do is use this method that tries to construct what a counterfactual Brazil would look like, right? What is a Brazil? Countries that have similar characteristics to Brazil before 1807, how they behave after 1807, an average of such countries. Okay, so we have a statistical method that selects, that tries to reproduce how the curve for Brazil looked like in terms of the wage before 1807, and says, if the shock of the end of slavery had not hit Brazil, this is how Brazil would have looked like. Okay, so I have a big control group of a lot of countries, but we don't take a simple average of these. Countries that had wages more similar to Brazil before 1807 are gonna get bigger weight. Okay, so this is done statistically, and this is the result. You see, the result is that immediately after the first prohibition, the wage for free men in Brazil, relative to this unobservable counterfactual Brazil, the wage rose about 30% in Brazil. After 1931, they rose 45%, and after 1850, 42% in the middle aftermath. So, how do we interpret this? In Brazil, there was a large urban labor market with free labor coexisting with slave labor. Slave labor was contracted for production in two ways, like I said before. Daily wage earners, escravos de ganho, enslaved with freedom to choose tasks if they are renting themselves out, otherwise the master is choosing to whom to rent and hence to what tasks if they're being rented to, and enslaved workers rented out. So high slave economy, we say there's this equilibrium that is the entire economy of Brazil was geared towards slavery, and the slave prohibition shocks are going to raise the price of slaves, and this will leave the slave owners and buyers and producers to use more free demand because now it's very expensive to use slaves. This will lead to more technical change, more change of capital goods that substitute for physical human labor, and this will lead to a higher wage equilibrium, higher wages for free men. I gave an example from Rio at the start. Here's an example from Bahia. When slaves were still around, they were carrying around people, because Bahia is very hilly, right? So they are carrying people around in this, as you can see there. Once slavery was no longer viable, they have to build an elevator, right? There's a technical change that this was the Lacerda elevator was built between 1869 and 1873 and was the highest elevator in the world at the time. And here's some evidence of the mechanism. This is from the 1872 census, so it's still before the complete end of slavery, but it is, many years after, so exactly 22 years after the end of the Atlantic slave trade. So there is still some residual slaves around, but there's no more fresh arrivals of slaves from Africa. And you can see that the slaves that remain are highly concentrated in high physical effort occupations. For example, in the census, we can see that for domestic service, more than 20% of people doing domestic service were slaves. You have to think of domestic slavery in a domestic service in a pre-plumbing era, right? That they have to carry buckets around of water and the feces and urine and so on, and then they have to do cleaning and all those things. Farm workers, servant, day laborers, like heavy physical effort. Slaves are being used a lot. For low physical effort, some are high human capital things, so slaves couldn't do them anyway, like being a lawyer, but they could be midwives, they could be livestock breeders in principle, they could be livestock breeders, but they were not being used for that. So this shows that, you know, that there is a substitution between free labor and slavery for the same kind of tasks. Even for domestic service, as you can see, there is more than 20% are slaves, but only about 20%. Of course, this is the first census we have by 1872, which, like I say, at this time, slavery was becoming a bit residual by then. Okay, so in conclusion, we showed that Brazil did not become poor in relative terms. Brazil began its history in the 16th century, well, its history from a Eurocentric point of view, that is, its history as a country for which we have written records, as a country that was rich by comparative terms. It was not poor by comparison with Europe, and certainly not by comparison with Africa or Asia at the time. The huge amount of slaves that were brought to Brazil is at least one, I'm not saying it's the only cause, but what we're saying is the central cause for what made Brazil much poorer and what prevented much higher levels of immigration that came in subsequent centuries. So real wages recovered with the end of the slave trade. Brazil's reckoning with the slave trade changed the development path in the 19th century, but this came too late to recover lost ground comparatively to other places in Americas and Europe by that time, although Brazil did recover compared with Africa and Asia. And so finally, I really want to emphasize then that, you know, every time you hear or you read somewhere that somehow slavery made the West rich or made Britain rich or made the United States rich, you have to keep the comparative numbers in perspective. Brazil got more than 10 times as many slaves as anything going to the United States. Okay, per capita, Portugal, which had a much more population than England, was much more heavily involved in the slave trade than was ever Britain, ever. Much more heavily involved, and Portugal did not have an industrial revolution. So the idea that to become rich, you need to rely on slavery really fails the most basic comparative test. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Quite challenging, I think. You know, the basic idea that slavery somehow wasn't behind, enslavement, slavery regimes weren't behind the enrichment of the West is a kind of counterintuitive idea, I think, by today's standards.
Yeah,
there we have your argument. I think there are some things I didn't quite understand. I mean, one thing is to say that slavery caused Brazil to be, relatively speaking, behind the Americas and Europe when you come to the 20th century. That's not the same thing as saying that slavery didn't enrich the Americas and Europe, or wasn't part of what fed into the industrialization of America and Europe. Those aren't the same statements. You seem to be conflating the two things. Another problem that I had was that the way you used the simple numbers of slaves to represent what slavery did in an entire economy. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I understood anyway was that the reason why Brazil had so many slaves compared to North America was because the mortality rate in Brazil was much, much higher than in North America. And in North America, they also weren't allowed to, they obeyed the abolition of the slave trade that happened in the early 19th century. And so they had to, they encouraged their existing slave population to reproduce.
That's right.
Naturally.
That's right.
So you know. Okay, well, I've got a couple of other things.
Okay, so let me write down those out.
Right. So the numbers of slaves isn't equivalent to the role of slavery in the economy, I don't think. The other thing that I was confused about.
I'm just writing down.
Okay. So the other thing that I was confused about was the way that you used real wages for unskilled workers to somehow represent the total wealth of the economy. It's like saying, you know, can we judge the wealth of Amazon and Jeff Bezos by looking at how much he pays his workers in an Amazon warehouse? Well, no. You know, one of the reasons why he's rich And why Amazon is rich is because he pays his workers very little. So that was something I was a bit confused about. And then the third thing was that, you know, I mean, I think it's been fairly well established that in the case of the UK, Britain, that a lot of the money that came from the very intensive slave plantation economy that existed in Jamaica and other British colonies, fed, and in the USA as well, fed directly into the process of industrialization. And I think that's fairly clear. So, you know, there was a sense in which you could say that the way that slavery was practiced in those particular colonies, in that particular circumstance, and given the fact that they abolished slavery in the early 19th century, or the slave trade in the early 19th century, precisely because they wanted to free labor up and they wanted to free up their economies. Was, you know, but that didn't mean to say that slavery didn't provide them with some capital to kickstart the process of industrialization. So I think, yeah, there's all kinds of things there that I find slightly problematic in your argument.
Right. So let's debate. We're here for that. Okay, just taking note. Okay, so on the issue, thanks, Peter. Very interesting comments, and I will try to answer, and we can debate. So on the banking US reach and the England, this is kind of connected to your last point about cotton and industrialization. But let me take one at a time. So here's what I defend in my work that actually made the West rich, as a proximate factor at least, in institutions, the way you politically organize a society. You know, in the 18th century, in this country, you had a parliament in charge. Even the king didn't have much power. Right? He gets a budget. What is the crown is different from what is the state. The parliament is, by the 18th century, is taking all the key decisions in the country. So there's no such thing as absolutism in 18th century Britain. It's not a modern democracy, but you know, the franchise is very limited. But there is a lot of checks and balances with political power. And this is, we have lots of evidence from economic history that that is what is spawning an industrial revolution. The parliament is taking actions that both in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the role that justices of the peace we're having, the parliament is taking actions that are leading to the industrialization of the country. Can you say that on the margin, given that, did slavery help Britain on the margin? Possibly, but if slavery only makes a country rich when that country has the right institutions, then the key explanation for why the country got rich is not the slavery, it's the institutions. It's multi-causal. But what is the key? What is the key aspect that can be missing? Because notice, in Portugal and Brazil, 11 times more slaves, and it was not enough. Without the institutions. Not just the number of slaves that matters, it's, you know, it's how much wealth they generate. Okay, but I'll get to that in a second. Okay, but that is conditional on the institutional system. Okay, sure. Right? So ultimately, the ultimate causal factor is the institutions, it's not the slave. Slaves without the institutions, no industrial revolution. Okay. So that means that what explains the wealth is the political institutions, it's not the existence of slaves. The institutions without the slaves aren't going to generate the wealth either. Yeah. But they did, because you have many countries in the world who follow. What was the second country in the world to have industrial revolution after Britain? USA. No. Belgium. No slaves. Oh, but they had a they were enslaving. Not at that time. Not when they industrialized. Okay. And the Belgian Congo was huge economic disaster. It didn't belong to the Belgian state, by the way, it belonged to the king initially, and it was a huge economic disaster. The numbers exist, we have the numbers. They lost money with it. That's why the state didn't want it. That's why the Belgians didn't want it, and the king had to get it, because it was a loss maker. So yeah, we can, I'm sure we could discuss a lot more of that, but on the issue of, I'll get back to that when I answer your point about income versus wealth, okay? So on the issue of fertility, the United States was the only slave society in the world in which slavery was largely self-reproducing to natural fertility. I mean, we've had many slave societies in the world. That's another argument, in my view, against the idea slavery makes societies rich. Otherwise, Roman Empire would be super rich. The Arab world that is slavery for centuries would be super rich. Many slave societies have existed in the world, where slavery was a lot heavier than it ever was as a percentage than in Britain. But the United States is specific in the sense that it had what we could think of a breeding strategy, right? But why did it have a breeding strategy? It was not like you suggested because of mortality, because actually in Brazil mortality was very low of settlers. Mortality was high for slaves because they were being overworked. And there's violence and so on. But for settlers, it's not like settler mortality was high because of diseases like malaria. Brazil didn't have these problems. So you have to think of the United States. The reason why they were better treated is not because of some cultural reasons. It's because they had a lot of value, precisely because the United States did not have the same access to fresh supplies that Portugal had for Brazil. So Portugal for Brazil, they could constantly rely on fresh supplies from Africa. So the ratio of slaves was very male dominant. In fact, in African societies, remember, Europeans did not invent slavery in Africa. When the Europeans arrived to Africa, these were slave-based societies, wealthy people already. Men were sent to Brazil, women were sent to the Arab world for harems and so on. So Brazil, slaves are there's a lot more males than females in Brazil. And they are dying a lot, relying on fresh supply. So you have to think of the higher death rates as a consequence of this Portugal's control over Angola and over the West African slave supplies. It didn't have to treat them as well. They didn't have to treat them as well as a result of that because they knew the price was low and they could keep importing. While in the United States, that was not the case. So that is why, in fact, these numbers I gave you do not translate well to stocks. So by the mid-19th century, these are the numbers of flows, how many over time. But by the mid-19th century, there were like 2 million slaves in the southern USA, out of these 300,000. And in Brazil, there would have been 1 million. A lot more died. There was not so many born and so on. Of course, the population of Brazil was also much smaller than US by then. So per capita, there's still more slaves in Brazil by mid-19th century, even if you include the north of US, not just the US South. So Brazil was a more slave-driven society, no question about it, always than the US ever was. But it is true that this 300,000 translates to 1 million by the mid-19th century, where in the USA, they translate to 2 million, right? So you're absolutely right that the death rates were different, fertility was different, but that is as a result, precisely, this is endogenous to our story. That is a result of this society being a slave-driven society dependent on fresh supplies. They could do that. Well, the US couldn't because it was very expensive to take slaves there. Even if you take the inter-American slave trade, this is direct disembarkations. If you take into account slaves that disembark in one port in the Americas and that are taken to a different port, to North American mainland, you got maybe 150,000 more, to Brazil 1 million more.
But I mean, North America, at least in the southern USA, was still a slave-driven society in exactly the same way as Brazil.
Exactly. Not the same way, even less. Even less than Brazil, a bit less than Brazil, but it's the same kind, yes. And what part of US became rich? Was that the part that became rich?
Oh no, but that's after the Civil War. Sorry.
Yeah.
First,
No, wait 1 second, please, because there was 4 points. Yeah, but before the Civil War, we have to update for that. Before the Civil War, the North was richer, not the South. The North was richer because the North was industrializing. You cannot this is my point. You cannot industrialize an economy that is slave-dependent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But sorry,
So slavery delays industrialization.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Okay. So slavery delays it. So this brings me to your last point on cotton and Jamaican industrialization. Again, you know, this is lacking comparative perspective from my point of view. And I give you some evidence on that. When there was the American Civil War, supplies from the Caribbean stopped and from the US South stopped. And did the cotton mills here around Manchester stop? They didn't. You know why? Because they easily substituted by Egyptian cotton immediately. And the price barely moved. So it showed that they were never dependent on slave labor. And in fact, textile mills, everything continued after the abolition of slavery, everything
Not
continued.
dependent, you don't need to argue that dependent on slave labor. Anyway, sorry. What, Angela, go ahead.
Right,
And then Ignacio and
I think that there is a fundamental problem for me on,
Oh, I didn't answer income versus wealth. Sorry, go ahead.
let's.
I think that there is a fundamental problem for me, and it's, to me, it's a really big problem with the statement that says societies do not get rich by slavery. I think it's very limiting because Brazil or Portugal, they are not isolated. They were part of a geopolitical system in which, you know, they are there doing their enslavement and creating this whole system of agriculture and production of goods that were then, you know, bought, used, reappropriated by exactly the nations who have become more developed, more or richer, etc., etc. Now, if you say that to become rich at that point in history, these nations would not necessarily have to depend on slavery, that's a speculative hypothesis, right? Because that's not what happened. We did have enslavement, we did have that, and we did have a lot of enrichment, including of political systems and economic systems in Europe and in the United States that were connected to slavery, to enslavement. So I think that the main problem is this statement. You have the data, and I think it's fascinating. You have really interesting data, and you can say slavery did not necessarily lead to a direct enrichment of the societies who were enslaving and who were using enslavement. And now to say that slavery does not lead to enrichment, that is a really wide claim that you're making that can be torn apart by other kinds of perspectives in this geopolitical system. You are isolating Brazil and Portugal as, you know, societies that did not become rich because of enslavement, when they were not isolated. They were connected to this whole. Portugal was a peripheral empire within Europe, right? It had all sorts of relationships with other countries that it owned money to, etc., etc. So I think that you need to.
Who did Portugal own money to?
Britain.
When?
We know that.
In the 16th century, 17th?
We know that, for example, in Brazilian independence, Brazil inherited Portuguese debt.
Yeah, but that's 19th century.
Still.
This story will have been undergone for 3 centuries by then.
Exactly, as a colony. Brazil as a colony. And then when Brazil becomes independent, you know, it's not only because of slavery, it's because of the whole bad deal that he made within this geopolitical scenario. So to me, I think that the correlation, the cause and effect correlation that you're making here is a little too fast. It's a little too quick.
Okay, I will try to answer, okay?
Okay, sure.
Okay, I don't know what's your field, but you know, in economic history, we ask a precise question. We'll give as far as we can, a precise answer. The question asked here is comparative. It's a question about comparative development. right? So the question I ask here, and we ask here in the first point, what were the consequences of the slave trade for Brazil? That's the question you're asking, and that's the primary question we're answering. And we're saying slavery did not make Brazil rich. Slavery made Brazil poorer. So ending slavery was not just normatively good from a humanitarian perspective, but ending slavery was also good for Brazil's own economic development as well. Okay? Now, the question you want me to answer is a different question than the one we are asking, although I concede that I also made a comparative argument. I said, if slavery did not make Brazil rich, should we not question the idea that slavery made the West rich?
That's a problem.
That's
Okay.
That's a big problem.
Right. That's a problem for you. I don't think it's a problem for me because I think the argument holds.
I think it's a problem for scholarship.
Well, yeah, that's your opinion, okay? So the situation is this. We have plenty of evidence for the Southern United States. All the scholarship that I would consider serious quantitative scholarship by people like Gavin Wright of Stanford, Paul Roddy of Michigan, systematically show that slavery made the US South poor and did not make the US North rich. That the US North did not become rich because of slavery, on the contrary. Okay. You are making an argument that somehow, although these were mercantilist economies, English boats could not go to Brazil before 1807. They could not go there. They were forbidden to go there.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
English boats could not go to Brazilian ports before 1807. You're making some sort of argument that these were all interdependent. What I'm saying is, when I look at the real reasons why there was an industrial revolution in this country, the real reasons have to do with the nature of the political institutions in this country, and it has nothing to do with the sugar produced in Brazil in the 17th century. Zero to do with the sugar produced in Brazil.
So what about the sugar produced in the West Indies?
Or the West Indies, because you know how much sugar is worth for the English economy 17th century?
Sugar is one thing, there's the whole, yeah, sorry.
Well, but you have to make it concrete. If you think that the kind of commodities that were being produced by this slave trade were somehow fundamental for the Industrial Revolution, you have to establish an exact causal link between what kind of commodities were produced to slaves, not even the English owned slaves, but the slaves owned by the Brazilians, and that this somehow created wealth in Britain. I have been studying this topic for 20 years. I do not know any evidence that suggests that was the case. On the contrary, I know the evidence that foreign imports to Britain were a very small share of the British economy in the 17th century. Negligible share. And so to make some sort of link between that and the massive political changes that we saw in the big center of constitutional change in this country, which was the 17th century, going first Civil War, then the Glorious Revolution, going to a completely different political system, that we have all the evidence that the parliament activity is spawning the Industrial Revolution. I see no relation with sugar or any kind of Brazilian commodities that were being produced then. You can make a point perhaps about monetization.
Slave trade? Slave trade?
But that's what I'm saying, slavery is negligible in value. One factory in Britain produced more value than the slave trade. I'm not saying slave trade did not make certain merchants rich. It did everywhere. What I'm saying is not an engine of growth. There is no serious evidence.
Because I think it's interesting what you're suggesting. My question is, I think nobody will argue that an industrial economy creates much more wealth than an extractive economy that relies on slave labor. I think that's argument is being, I mean, to give you an example from another place in the mid-19th century when they were discussing the liberation of the serfs in Russia, we were making that argument. An industrial economy with wage labor creates much more wealth. It's impossible to compare both because one is operating at a very different level. So my point is,
But did Britain become rich because of the service?
So you're not discussing Britain, you're discussing Brazil.
No, I'm giving.
And also there is point of contention, sorry, I want to finish the comment. And also there is this theological thing that like there is a direction of travel for nations that will become all wealth, all rich, unless and in this case, this became poor, as if there was sort of all nations are going into that path, and slavery was the obstacle that implied that Brazil didn't follow that same direction. Well, maybe it's more accurate to say that maybe it's not that it became poorer, it created less wealth than other societies that were embracing industrial capitalism, and that wealth was not distributed
Yeah.
among
Population.
the population, or was concentrated, because that's another variable that Peter mentioned, like how you measure the wealth of an economy. Is it the average salary of a person, or how much that economy produces? And I mean, that's another, these are the two things I want to ask.
Right. So on the first point, I'm glad you mentioned serfdom in Russia and so on, because, you could try to make the same kind of argument that was made before for serfdom in Russia. Somehow serfdom in Russia was generating wheat that was being sold. We have to look at the numbers. These numbers are negligible. I'm sorry for the sentiment, I know the numbers. Now, the point about wealth versus income is interesting, and Peter had raised that before. It is true that what this is saying, and this is the data we have, this is about wage inequality, and this is not about wealth inequality. So this is not a GDP even, and even in GDP has limited information about distribution. The GDP per capita. This is how much a free man who is unskilled earns. But the advantage of this is, especially for the periods we have females, this is most of the economy. This is most of the workers that are free at here. They were either slaves or they're unskilled free people. This does not include the very wealthy merchants. That's exactly right. But that's why I also said before, I have nothing against the argument that some wealthy merchants got rich because of slave trade. Surely some did. I mean, there's some nice palaces in Lisbon, nice looking from the outside, that are built by slave merchants, right? But that's also true in London, right? In every society that dealt with slavery, some rich merchants were rich because of slavery.
And some of those merchants also kickstarted the whole process of industrialization.
No, that's incorrect.
Oh, okay.
Yes, that's the part that's incorrect, because if that was true, per capita, like I said before, there were a lot more rich merchants of those kinds per capita in Portugal as a share of Portugal's economy, much bigger than ever was in Britain, much bigger. And for sure in the Roman Empire, huge, right? This is the point, right? That you can say, if you can try to argue that's some sort of necessary condition, I don't think it was, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition. Because if it was, again, Portugal would be the richest country in Brazil in this period.
Andrea, you have Andrea first, and then John.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm just a bit curious about what's your definition of development, because you never really explain what counts as development. And I'm especially curious about how can we do a comparative development approach in regions that are, one is the colonizer, the other is the colonized. So obviously, like a colonized nation is going to develop differently to like one that's getting a lot from extraction of resources and labor as well.
Yes.
The colonized areas. So that's my first question. And then my second question is about you're measuring development by increasing wages, but does inequality feature into development? Because, for example, when the slavery was abolished in Peru, I'm not that familiar with the case of Brazil, but I think it's similar. A lot of the previously enslaved couldn't really get a job in like well-paid jobs. Most of them just got jobs in very low-paid domestic services jobs, and that has continued to the present day. So we continue seeing that. So then, yeah, the wages increase for some, but then they also remain on the lower side for others.
Right. So that I agree with your last point. That's why at the end of the presentation, I said that when Brazil had its reckoning with the slave trade, wages rose, but not sufficiently to catch up, because it's a society with a big labor force, many poor people, right? It was quite unequal by then. So, but that is itself a result of these 3 centuries of the slave trade, right? And clearly the path of Brazil, despite all that inequality and despite all the inequality that also exists in the US South, is today a much poorer country than the US South is. And our view is, we're not saying this is the only cause to explain that, but this is part of the explanation of that, is that Brazil at one point became so locked in to becoming a slave society. On your point of what is development, I mean, here we have a very simple measure. Is it a super complete multidimensional measure? No, but it's what we can measure historically. And we're measuring it in a way that is as fair as possible in order to make international comparisons.
So it's economic.
Well, yeah, this is, but this is how much people can eat, how many baskets they can buy of these, right? So you would recognize that the society in which people can eat better, eat more cassava, more meat, more beans, get more candles for their homes, get more fuel for heating, get more clothes, linen to get, it's in principle they consume more. If they're happier or not, happiness, the relationship between consumption and happiness is complex. But in principle, a society where people are not starving, we would expect them to be happier. And there is a literature in economics that shows a very close correlation, in fact, between, it's true that societies that are more unequal, they can also create unhappiness for people. But if you're in this line, you're kind of starving or almost starving. Nobody likes to see their child starve, right? And while here, you can consume 6 to 9 baskets, nobody's starving. So in principle, we can think of a society where people can buy 6 to 9 baskets as a society that is more economically developed than one where people can buy 1 basket, right? An advantage of this method is that it is limited in the sense that, it's just the basket of these goods. So for example, maybe in Europe, you could go to the theater if you wanted, in Brazil, you couldn't. It's only the goods that are here that we are comparing, but at least they are roughly comparable across places and across time. And, if we say everything is subjective, we can't compare anything, we don't reach any conclusions. This is limited, but at least it's consistent across time and consistent across space. We can compare very different. So you also ask, how can we compare colonized with colonies? Yes, we can, because we are comparing precisely how many baskets they can buy. Brazil is a colony at this time, Portugal is the colonizing power, but we can compare Brazil with colony using this method precisely because you can see here, Lisbon is one of these locations. This is Lisbon. So we can compare, if you live in Bahia, how many baskets you can buy. If you live in Lisbon, how many baskets you can buy, if you are a free man.
But then I think you should add economic development or make more precise that you are referring to that.
Well, but I said that this is our measure. No, this is our measure of living standards. We are measuring living standards over time, right?
John, go ahead.
So, well, thank you very much. Very robust and provocative argument. I have to say I agree with almost all of the objections that have been presented to it. It also doesn't seem to me, it reminds me of the whole argument about the causes for the US Civil War, right? It's the Northern industrialists felt that the slave-owning economy of the South was a fetter on development and production, and that's what it was. But but my question is a different one. Let's just.
So I didn't get what you said.
But it doesn't matter. That's an aside.
Because if the South was creating wealth, they shouldn't have
I'll get to my question. Which is, let's assume that everything you say is true. Okay? So my question is about the political implications.
Right.
So as you know, the last, 10, 15 years or so, there's been an attempt to think about the contribution of slavery, and for instance, the UK, but also the US's involvement in slavery, and how that's contributed to institutions such as this one, the University of Manchester. I have here a page from the University of Manchester website, which talks about, well, you know, John Rylands, one of the mid-Victorian Britain's leading cotton manufacturers, amassed a vast fortune from his firm's use of slave-bound crops, and then it's his widow who sets up the Rylands Library. And this, presumably you say, no, that his wealth doesn't derive from that, it derives from Britain's political institutions. And so, but this whole attempt to rethink the responsibility that people at Manchester University or other universities or other institutions such as Manchester, which we tend to believe did indeed profit from the trade in enslaved people, from the slave labor in the Caribbean, and we'll think about ways in which we might make reparations, even symbolically, perhaps to some extent economically, to those societies or those people, in the sense of those people. But presumably the force of your argument would say, given that the slave trade did not in fact benefit or lead to help to the establishment of these institutions, our responsibility for that historical fact is now rendered minimal. Is that the political take that we should walk away with after your lecture?
No, because our book is not about that. That's the short answer. Our book is not about that. But let me answer you. So first of all, nothing here denies that John Rylands benefited possibly from the slave trade. I said it before. In Lisbon, you have lots of palaces and possibly academies of science, things like that, that possibly were built through merchants involved with the slave trade, right? You've never heard me deny that, right? You never heard me deny that some people in the West got rich with the slave trade, just like some people in Africa itself, by the way.
But actually, no, this isn't about people, right? You're talking about people. This is about an institution, such, in fact, a whole set of institutions, an entire sector. If we're thinking about universities,
well, maybe the University of Coimbra, I don't know, in Portugal benefited. I don't know. It's likely that they did, right? The point is, was the engine of development of the West slavery? Was that what made the West rich? And to cure this type of comparative evidence, immediately says it didn't. Because if more slavery means richer countries, Portugal and Brazil would be the richest. So if I can get you to concede that at least that was not the fundamental factor, we can find some common ground already.
But I'm hypothesizing that we agree. So if we agree, am I now freed from any sense of responsibility and now working in an institution that I now no longer think is founded through wealth provided by self-labor, slave labor?
Again, this is a scientific paper. This is not a normative political activist paper. That is a completely separate discussion. That is not what this paper is about.
But I'm asking you a question about politics to say, well, what are the political
I'm not a
implications of this paper?
politician, I'm a scientist. I gather data. I'm an historian. I'm an economist. I am not, this paper is not about that. It's not about that.
Okay, I think we've come to the end.
I can tell you that implementing that is perhaps more complex than you might think, because, for example, African elites themselves were heavily involved in the slave trade. They were the fundamental factors. Are you gonna make some Africans pay to other Africans too? Very complex issue. More than often it's said to be.
Okay, we've got Nuno, and then there's a couple of people in the online who want to make contributions.
Sure. So can we make this parallelism with your argument, which is slavery is kind of marginal to the, or even you say it didn't contribute to Portugal and Brazil to be wealthier than say England,
Yeah.
right? Can we extrapolate to being slavery wealth generated from the slave thing is marginal to the overall wealth of the state? Can we say this?
You mean the Britain?
No, both in Brazil and Portugal and Britain.
Yeah, for all of them was
You can,
marginal.
it's marginal, okay.
Yeah.
So if you say this, and I might be saying here.
And it was one of the least profitable activities you as a capitalist could put your money into.
But yeah, okay. Considering this, and again, I'm not an economist, and I just knowledge, right?
Yeah.
I heard or read sometime, because I think I paid a bit of it as taxpayer in this country, that the bailout for the end of slavery in the UK was the biggest bailout ever bigger than the 2012.
For the slave owners, you mean?
So slave owners,
Yeah,
right? It was the biggest slavery, and I think I paid a bit of it, because it's only ended paid in 2014 or something, I don't know.
Sure.
A question to you is, if, I might be saying something really silly economic
Mhm.
wise, right? But if the systemic risk of
Yeah.
the end of slavery was led to the biggest bailout
Yeah.
in money, isn't that an indicator, qualitatively speaking, that slavery was much more systemic for the economy than just the argument against it?
No, my answer is no, and I give you two pieces of evidence for that. The first is that the argument against abolitionism was precisely, from the people defending slavery, including Liverpool, was precisely that it would break the back of the British economy, that they completely depended on it. You couldn't abolish, yes, it was not nice to those people, but we depend on that. And the history has shown that was not true. Slavery was abolished and the industrial revolution continued smoothly. Even after it was also abolished in the US South, even after it was abolished in Brazil, it continues smoothly. Secondly, on the bailout, there's a lot of misunderstandings about the payment, the compensation to slave owners. First of all, is again about paying merchants. Some rich merchants were compensated. Now, of course, this looks evil, and we can all agree that the whole institution of slavery was evil. But this looks evil from our point of view today. You're even compensating the people who have been enslaved, but that was the only way to end slavery. If you didn't compensate, you would have continued. You wanted slavery to continue? Politically, the only way to end it was to compensate. You're expropriating something.
To not
They were
a
considered
not a
property.
systemic economic risk for the economy.
Well, that's what the slave owners argue it would be. We saw it wasn't. But again, think of it politically. Slaves were property. If the government comes and expropriates your property, I mean, if they don't even promise to compensate you, there's going to be a civil war. You're not going to let this happen, right? So if we all agree that ending slavery was good, and I even agree more than you because I even say it was good for development, it created more development. The people who today are very more disturbed about slavery seem to think slavery was somehow good for development. That's what I've heard here among some of you in this room, that slavery somehow was creating development in Britain. I'm saying no, it wasn't. Right? It was not creating development anyway. It was making some elites rich. It was increasing inequality, right? And so you have to compensate those people, otherwise it would have continued. So of course you compensated. It was the right strategy for the parliament to compensate them.
Even with the robustness of the institutional setting that you say is a key driver for economic.
Of course, it was precisely the fact that you had a parliament that is discussing these things that was able to create a political compromise of abolishing slavery by compensating people for their capital losses.
We've got some people on Zoom who want to make that. Alejandra, can you hear me? Or you obviously can. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Nuno.
Hi,
Very good to see you. Well, I want to thank you both, Peter and Nuno, for bringing this together. It's a real breakthrough, actually, to see economic historians and historians in a conversation. I'm sorry, I'm gonna bring you back to Brazil, because I think that the last interventions went far away from Brazil. And I have a question and two comments for Nuno. Nuno, I wonder if there is, I mean, you were using nominal reais, right? In the comparison in the wages.
These are deflated by Allen baskets.
No, I know, but there was a chart with the I think the wages in reais.
These are real. You want the nominal ones? The nominal.
No. I mean, I should to make it comparable over time. Yeah, it's just a question because I didn't get it.
These are in real wages, so they are divided by the basket.
Okay, so the wages and the why they were real wages, because it says reais and it wasn't clear.
It says real wage.
It's the currency.
Yeah.
Reais is the current, that's nominal, but this is real, Alejandro. This is
No, I know, I know, but in that graph it says react. Well, anyway, it's trifle. Now, for your argument, which I fully buy, I think that you would need two things in addition to that, because there is an association, there is a coevolution, but we don't have the smoking gun. Now, it would be impossible, but in any case, it would make your argument stronger if you would, for the substitution, if you can bring in some demographic data, because the population stock changes dramatically over the 300 years. The alternative, and that's why I explained this very high number of baskets at the beginning, yeah? That's one thing. And the other is the number of, you would have benchmark for that, of free Africans in Brazil. So far, the comparison with the United States and so on is about the number of slaves disembarked. Okay, just to make, that won't change anything of what you are saying, but somehow to make it, at least the argument. The substitution in terms of the population stock and the number of free Africans in Brazil, at least for some period of time, because this is very different from the United States as well. Just for you to think.
Yeah. Are you in Buenos Aires or London?
No, neither. I'm online and we can get on a Zoom whenever you want.
Okay.
But thank you so much. It's very, very interesting, and it was fascinating to hear the discussion. So far, this is for me.
That's why. Okay. Alejandro is my friend from Argentina.
Yeah.
Okay. On the first point, Alejandro raised the issue of the nominal. The only figure we show nominal amounts is this one, but that's because we're just comparing relative price.
Yeah.
That's why we show nominal. And on the issue of how many free slaves there were over time, we have a few sentences of that on the paper.
Okay.
Compared to also the United States, but I don't know of systematic comparative data on that, so that's why we don't show any table on the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alejandra. Frank, are you there?
There's Frank Barroso raised the hand.
Yeah. Frank, can you
Hi.
hear?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Nuno, for the paper, and so I had two comments / questions. And the first one is very much kind of Alejandra kind of bid me to it. I buy the argument about the impact of slavery in terms of the economic development of Brazil, and I understand the real wage comparison, but you don't in any way address the fact that free unskilled laborers are not the same in all the places you're comparing, right? And for places like Brazil and large parts of Spanish America, and Brazil especially after the significant introduction of slaves in the early 17th century, gradually become a highly racialized component of the population. And that in itself affects the wages that they're being paid, right? How we estimate that, I'm not entirely sure, but that's something that should be built into the argument, right? The other thing is, as I said, I very much buy the argument that slavery did not make Brazil, and for that matter, any other slave society rich. I buy the argument that it hindered development. But you're making a jump from that to the slavery did not make the West rich without really building the blocks that would take you there. With the exception of the US, and we do know that, as you said yourself, the economies of the South and the North were completely different, and the part that industrializes and the part that leads the US into becoming a advanced modern economy as it is today is the North. No slave society became wealthy out of slavery. when we say that the West became wealthy because of slavery, it's not the slave societies, it's the societies that benefited from the slavery happening elsewhere. And that is something your argument doesn't explain, right? So how do you make that leap from saying Brazil, as other slave societies, did not benefit from slavery, that I buy, but that is not the same as saying the West, which was not a slave society, did not benefit from slavery?
Well, thanks so much. Great question. So I think the sense I get from the room, including from you, Frank, is that maybe I convince you that slavery did not make Brazil rich, it made Brazil poorer. If I'm convinced of that, I'm already happy today, okay? That slavery made Brazil poorer. In the counterfactual absence of slavery in Africa, Brazil might have had a very different development path than the one it did. If I've already convinced you of that, I'm already happy. There's the second part of the argument that I concede is a bit more difficult to make, but it's intrinsically a comparative argument, which is to which extent slavery, this comparative evidence that shows that for Brazil and for Portugal, slavery was a much bigger share of these economies than ever was for Britain and the United States. And I've made the argument that because that's the case, this puts a big question mark in the idea that somehow slavery made the US or Britain rich. You question now the part about the mother country, the colonizer, right? So you said that perhaps it didn't make the Americas rich, but it made Britain rich. But the point is that if that was true, this slave trade to Brazil should have made Portugal rich. As a share of the Portuguese economy, slavery had a much bigger weight, much bigger, 2, 3, 4, 5 times bigger weight in early modern period than it ever did for Britain. So now the point is not about Brazil, it's about Portugal. Portugal did not have an industrial revolution, right? So if slavery comparatively was enough to make the society that was engaging heavily in that slavery rich, Portugal should have become super rich. And did Portugal get free merchants? Yes, there are palaces built in Lisbon through slave money. Okay, they are just like they are in London or in Liverpool. Okay, or John London's library or whatever. Okay, fine. What I'm saying is that was not an engine of development. That was not sufficient to make a country rich. Even a country that had 10 times as many slavery per capita as Britain did not get rich because of that. So that is suggestive that what made Britain rich was not that slavery. And if you had 10 times more slavery in Britain, that would not have made Britain richer, or for that matter, 10 times less slavery in Britain, right? As we could see, in fact, with the abolition of slavery that did not stop the Industrial Revolution, like all the people defending slavery against abolitionists were arguing that it would.
Okay, I think I put my finger on the problem, which is that to say that slavery didn't enrich Britain, let's say, is not the same as saying that, because I think it probably did, but that doesn't mean to say that it was an engine for growth.
But what's Britain, Peter?
Some
rich merchants.
Yeah, okay, so
that's not Britain. That's not the working class in Britain.
Whatever. I'm not talking about working class. I'm talking about the whole economy of Britain. There was enrichment going on, but that enrichment wasn't necessarily the same as providing an engine for growth towards industrialization. Because we all know that industrialization and slavery are opposed to each other in terms of, possibilities for growth, as you were saying. The part of the reason for abolition was to free labor up so that you could industrialize and grow. So we know
that's what Marx saw, but that's not true.
But that's not the same as saying that there wasn't a process of enrichment going from slave colonies towards.
But if there was, Portugal would have been in a much better position to have an industrial revolution. Because
but I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about relative enrichment. A transfer of wealth from the
right. So you cannot ignore the comparative evidence. If the mechanism you just described was true and mattered a lot, you get rich through the wealth because of the slave trade and so on, and then you have the right preconditions for industrialization.
No, I don't think that's the case. That's not the point. The point is that there's no reason to link enrichment to industrialization. They're two different things. That's what I think.
But industrialization created enrichment,
Yeah, of course, in a different way. But it didn't depend on the enrichment from the slave society.
Oh, but I agree with that.
Yeah, okay, there you go. That's what I think, but it's not the same as saying that
Right.
those metropoles weren't enriched by slavery. That's a different thing. Anyway, okay.
Really
Last one,
quickly,
very well. Yeah.
I think I got your point. And I think that if your point is, and I'm going to be a bit bold, if your point is to say slavery wasn't good for anything, not even economically, not even to make, nations rich.
For who? For who? Because for rich merchants getting rich through it, of course, it was good for them personally, right? So you cannot say for anything. I'm saying for the broad development of the society.
In terms of the broad development of
Yes.
society. So slavery was not the kind of pathway, economic pathway
Exactly.
that some people or some scholars are claiming that it was.
Right.
It was one of the pathways of enrichment together with all sorts of other ones. But you're saying
Not
that
for a
in some
society as a
places-
whole, not for a society as a whole.
But you're saying that in some places it was like Brazil, Portugal, etc. The contexts are very different. Political contexts are very different between these places. But if you're saying, if we can go back to your political concern, because it's concerning, right? It might be misinterpreted. What the presentation might be misinterpreted in the sense that you were talking about. But we know that knowledge and power in politics are intertwined. We know that, right? Someone somewhere is going to appropriate the knowledge that we create to do stuff that we have no idea what's going to happen to it, right? But if your argument, I fully embrace and accept your argument. Very arrogant here. If the argument is, look, guys, enslavement isn't, it never was a good path for development anywhere. It was a mistake, in fact. It was we know that it was a moral mistake, it was a political mistake, etc., etc. But now you're giving us the evidence, the number evidence to say that it was also an economic mistake.
Right.
And that
It's an economic mistake insofar as it doesn't lead to industrialization. That's the thing I think that you're trying to argue.
Yeah, but industrialization is the source of modern economic growth. That's why the West became so much richer. That's why in the 19th century.
But again,
Britain,
racial distribution plays a role, because if you look at the early decades of industrialization, the living conditions of people,
Oh,
the
it's
workers in Manchester were terrible. And that led to an increase of colonial expansion in order to guarantee raw material and new markets, which brought a lot of violent destruction, particularly in Africa and Asia. And Africa was already hindered by centuries of Europeans kidnapping the youth.
But he's not talking about
And
oppression.
so what I'm saying again, industrialization didn't create wealth for all. It created wealth for a certain specific class.
No wants to make the
Sorry.
point.
It's a quick one. If you stop the analysis in 1800s and the what if history was we didn't have industrialization, would the result be the same? I.e. Brazil and Portugal probably be richer than countries that equally didn't industrialize because we didn't have industrial revolution. That's one question. Perhaps too much what we did. The second one is, if you measure this in productivity terms, would it be different the result? Because the slave is more productive.
I mean, I would love to get into all these debates, but we would be here all night. But the last question is easiest to answer. Wages for free men reflect productivity. So looking at wages or looking at productivity is very similar. It's very similar.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to call it a day because we're running 10 minutes over time. We're going to the left sandbar. You can take up the
The gentleman wants reparations. He wants to.
You make me feel much less guilty. So that was pretty good.
No, it's not. It was so shitty.
Those were new.
That
We're going
didn't
to the
say
sandbar
money.
now.
I feel it's a slave but sacrifice is slave labor.
No, that I can't remember. It was so shitty. Even if